The August sun beat down on Westfield University as students streamed across campus for the first day of classes. Among them walked Imani Johnson, a slender young woman with her hair pulled back in neat braids, clutching her campus map tightly in her hand. She was exactly on time for her first college class, advanced calculus with the famous Dr. Reynolds. Imani had been dreaming of this day since she was 14. Growing up in a small apartment with her grandmother and two younger brothers, she had spent countless nights solving math problems by the light of a desk lamp while her family slept. Her high school had few resources, but her math teacher, Mrs. Garcia, had recognized something special in Imani's quick mind and stayed after school to give her extra problems. You could go anywhere with that brain, Mrs. Garcia had told her. And now, here she was, the first in her family to go to college, with a full scholarship to one of the best mathematics programs in the country. As Imani entered the large lecture hall, she noticed something immediately. In a room of nearly 100 students, she appeared to be the only black person. She took a deep breath and chose a seat in the second row, carefully arranging her new notebooks and pens. The room quieted as a tall man with gray hair and glasses walked to the front. Dr. Reynolds was known worldwide for his work in multivariable calculus. Imani had read all his published papers. "Welcome to advanced calculus," he said, looking around the room. "Some of you belong here. Some of you," his eyes seemed to rest on Imani for an extra moment, "may find yourselves overwhelmed." Imani sat up straighter. She had earned this spot just like everyone else. After class, students gathered around Dr. Reynolds to introduce themselves. Imani joined the small crowd, waiting patiently for her turn. "Dr. Reynolds, I'm Jason Miller. I read your paper on Riemann surfaces last summer. It was brilliant," said a tall boy in a blue shirt. "Ah, excellent. Always good to see students taking initiative," Dr. Reynolds smiled, shaking the boy's hand. When it was finally Imani's turn, she stepped forward with a confident smile. "Dr. Reynolds, I'm Imani Johnson. I'm very excited to study under you. I particularly enjoyed your work on topological manifolds." Dr. Reynolds glanced at her briefly. "Ms. Johnson, yes. Well, tried to keep up." He turned away to greet the next student. That evening, Imani sat in her small dorm room, staring at her calculus textbook. Her roommate hadn't moved in yet, so the room was quiet except for the distant sounds of students laughing in the hallway. "It's just the first day," she told herself. "You belong here." She opened the book to the first chapter, even though she had already read it twice over the summer. As she worked through the problems, the familiar rhythm of mathematics calmed her mind. Numbers and symbols flowed from her pen, forming beautiful patterns of logic that made perfect sense to her. By midnight, Imani had finished not only the assigned problems but the entire first 3 chapters of extra exercises. She looked at her work with satisfaction. Whatever Dr. Reynolds or anyone else thought of her, this was where she belonged, in the elegant, perfect world of mathematics. Tomorrow would be another day, and Imani Johnson was ready. 3 weeks passed quickly at Westfield University. Imani settled into a routine of classes, study sessions at the library, and quiet evenings solving extra problems in her dorm room. Her roommate, Lily, a biology major, often watched in amazement as Imani covered page after page with complex equations. "I don't know how you do that," Lily would say, shaking her head. "It looks like another language to me." Imani would just smile. To her, mathematics was indeed a language, the clearest one she knew. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Imani sat in the second row of Dr. Reynolds' advanced calculus class. She took careful notes and always completed her assignments early. Despite her efforts, Dr. Reynolds never called on her when she raised her hand, and he returned her perfect homework with only brief checks and no comments. On this particular Wednesday, something felt different. As students filed into the lecture hall, Imani noticed a second professor sitting at the front of the room. She recognized him immediately, Dr. Whitman, the department chair whose stern face appeared on the mathematics department website. "Today we have a special guest," Dr. Reynolds announced after everyone was seated. "My esteemed colleague, Dr. Whitman, has kindly agreed to observe our class." Dr. Whitman nodded, his eyes scanning the room of students. "Before we begin our regular lecture," Dr. Reynolds continued, "we thought it would be interesting to pose a challenge problem. This will help us see who truly understands the material." The room grew quiet, Dr. Reynolds wrote a complex equation on the board, a difficult integration problem involving multiple variables that went far beyond what they had covered in class. Now, who would like to attempt this? Dr. Reynolds asked, his eyes moving across the front rows until they stopped at Imani. Ms. Johnson, perhaps you would like to show us your approach? Imani felt her heart beat faster. This problem was clearly meant to be impossible for a first-year student. She could feel everyone's eyes on her as she slowly stood up. Yes, sir, she said quietly, walking to the board. Dr. Reynolds handed her the chalk with a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. Dr. Whitman leaned forward in his chair. Take your time, Dr. Reynolds said, in a tone that suggested he expected her to fail. This is quite advanced. Imani stared at the problem, locking out the whispers from behind her. She took a deep breath and let the numbers and symbols speak to her in their familiar language. Her hand moved to the board, and the chalk made a soft scratching sound as she began to work. Step by step, she broke down the complex problem, applying techniques she had learned from Dr. Reynolds' own published papers that she had studied over the summer. The whispers died down. The room grew completely silent. After 5 minutes of steady work, Imani stepped back from the board. She had filled it with a clean, elegant solution that took a creative approach to the integration. I believe this is correct, she said, turning to face her professors. Dr. Reynolds' confident smile had disappeared. Dr. Whitman was leaning even further forward, his eyes moving back and forth across her work. That's not the approach I would have used, Dr. Reynolds said finally. But it is correct, Dr. Whitman said slowly, and remarkably efficient. He looked at Imani with new interest. Where did you learn this method? From Dr. Reynolds' paper on multivariable integration techniques, Imani said. I studied it over the summer. For the first time, Dr. Reynolds looked truly at Imani, seeing not just a student who didn't fit his expectations, but a young mathematician with real talent. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. As students gathered their things, many glanced at Imani with new respect. Ms. Johnson, Dr. Whitman called as she returned to her seat. I believe you and I should have a conversation about your future in our program. Imani nodded, a small smile forming on her face. The challenge had been meant to shame her, but instead, it had revealed exactly who she was. Imani sat nervously in Dr. Whitman's office the next day. The room was lined with bookshelves filled with mathematics textbooks and academic journals. Awards and diplomas hung on the walls. Dr. Whitman sat behind a large desk, looking at Imani over his reading glasses. Your performance yesterday was unexpected, he said, tapping his pen against a notepad. Dr. Reynolds entered the office and took a seat beside Imani, not making eye contact with her. We wanted to discuss your background, Dr. Whitman continued. Your file shows you came from East Side High School. I'm not familiar with their mathematics program. It's a public school in my neighborhood, Imani explained. We didn't have many advanced classes, but my teacher, Mrs. Garcia, gave me extra work. Dr. Reynolds cleared his throat. That doesn't explain how you solved a graduate-level problem using techniques from my research papers. Imani sat up straighter. I've been teaching myself advanced calculus since I was 15. The library in my neighborhood didn't have many math books, so I took the bus to the city library every Saturday. When I read about your work, Dr. Reynolds, I requested your papers through interlibrary loan. Both professors looked surprised. Show us it wasn't a fluke, Dr. Whitman said suddenly, sliding a sheet of paper across the desk. Solve this. Imani looked down at another complex problem. She took a deep breath and picked up a pencil. The familiar calm of mathematical thinking washed over her as she worked through the problem step by step. 10 minutes later, she handed the paper back. Dr. Whitman checked her work carefully, his eyebrows rising higher as he read. He passed the paper to Dr. Reynolds. Perfect, Dr. Whitman said quietly. And you found a more elegant solution than the standard approach. Dr. Reynolds put down the paper, his face unreadable. Why didn't you speak up more in class, Ms. Johnson? Imani met his eyes. I tried, sir. I raised my hand many times, but you never called on me. The office fell silent. Dr. Reynolds had the good grace to look uncomfortable. Well, Dr. Whitman said, breaking the silence, it seems we have a genuine talent in our program. He turned to a shelf behind him and pulled down a thick book. Have you read Kaslov's work on topological manifolds? Parts of it, Imani admitted. The city library didn't have a copy, and it's expensive to buy. Keep this one, Dr. Whitman said, handing her the book. I want to see what you think of Chapter 7 particularly. As Imani left the office, clutching the valuable book, she heard Dr. Whitman say to Dr. Reynolds, "We nearly missed this one, David. How many others have we missed because of our assumptions?" News of Imani's mathematical abilities spread quickly through the department. Students who had barely noticed her before now watched her with curiosity. Some were impressed, others skeptical. She must have cheated somehow, one boy said loudly in the dining hall when Imani walked by. No way, she just figured that out on her own. His friend shrugged. I don't know, man. Dr. Chen told me she solved a problem in his class that he deliberately left unsolved as a challenge. Said she came up with an approach he hadn't thought of. That Friday, in advanced calculus, Dr. Reynolds called on Imani when she raised her hand to answer a question. After class, he asked her to stay behind. Ms. Johnson, Imani, he said, looking uncomfortable. I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your abilities that were unfounded and unfair. Imani nodded, accepting his words. I'd like to offer you a place in my research group, he continued. We meet on Thursdays. Your perspective could be valuable. As Imani walked across campus, the autumn leaves crunched under her feet. For the first time since arriving at Westfield, she felt truly seen. Not just as a student who didn't seem to belong, but as a mathematician with ideas worth hearing. There would be more challenges ahead, she knew. But today, the language of mathematics had spoken for her when other words could not. Imani's life at Westfield University changed dramatically over the next 2 weeks. Instead of blending into the background, she now found herself the subject of curious glances and whispered conversations. Some students looked at her with new respect. Others seemed uncomfortable, as if her success somehow threatened them. Thursday evening arrived, and Imani made her way to the mathematics research building for Dr. Reynolds' research group meeting. She paused outside the door, taking a deep breath before entering. Inside, 5 graduate students and 2 other professors sat around a large table covered with papers. Ah, Ms. Johnson, Dr. Reynolds said, gesturing to an empty chair. Please join us. Imani sat down, feeling out of place among the older students. A graduate student with glasses glanced at her with obvious skepticism. This is Imani Johnson, a first-year student who has shown exceptional ability, Dr. Reynolds explained to the group. She'll be joining us as a special case. A freshman? Asked the student with glasses. No offense, we're working on published research here. Dr. Reynolds cleared his throat. Thomas, Imani solved the Karsten integration problem in under 5 minutes. I think she can keep up. Thomas frowned but said nothing more. Dr. Reynolds began explaining their current project, an extension of his work on differential geometry with applications to physics. As the discussion progressed, Imani stayed quiet, absorbing the complex ideas. When Dr. Reynolds wrote a particularly difficult equation on the whiteboard, she noticed a small error in his work. Excuse me, she said hesitantly. I think there's a mistake in the 3rd line. The room went silent. Thomas smirked, clearly expecting her to be wrong. Dr. Reynolds examined his work. What mistake? The partial derivative should be with respect to x, not e, Imani explained. Otherwise, the boundary conditions won't hold when you apply the theorem in the next step. Dr. Reynolds stared at the board for a long moment, then checked his notes. You're right, he said finally. Good catch. Thomas's smirk disappeared. The other graduate student beside Imani, a woman named Maya, gave her an approving nod. After the meeting, Maya approached Imani as they walked out of the building. That was impressive, she said. Don't mind Thomas. He acts that way with everyone. How did you end up in Reynolds' research group as a freshman? Imani explained what had happened in class, and Maya shook her head. Classic Reynolds move, trying to embarrass a student, she said. He did something similar to me last year. I'm glad it backfired on him this time. As they walked across campus, Maya told Imani about other research groups she might be interested in. Dr. Chen's quantum mathematics group is doing some fascinating work, and Dr. Patel just got a new grant for her project on mathematical modeling of climate systems. You think they would let me join? Imani asked. After what you did in Reynolds' class? Absolutely. Word travels fast in a math department. The next morning, Imani received an email from Dr. Whitman inviting her to a special seminar for advanced students. Later that day, Dr. Chen stopped her in the hallway to discuss a paper he thought she might find interesting. Not everyone was supportive, however. After class on Monday, Imani overheard two students talking just outside the door. It's obvious why they're making such a big deal about her, one said. The department needs diversity for their brochures. Yeah, the other agreed. Bet they wouldn't care if she were just some regular white guy like us. Imani's cheeks burned as she walked past them. Their words stung, but she tried to push them away. She knew the truth. Her mathematics spoke for itself. That evening, as she worked on problems for Dr. Whitman's seminar, Imani's phone buzzed with a text from her grandmother. How's my college girl doing today? Imani smiled and typed back. Making my way, Grandma. One equation at a time. She returned to her work with renewed focus. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Imani Johnson had never expected it to be. What mattered was that doors were opening, and she was ready to walk through them. October brought changing leaves and midterm exams to Westfield University. Imani's calendar filled with study groups, research meetings, and extra problems from the professors who had taken an interest in her. While her mathematical world expanded, she noticed a growing division among the faculty. Some professors, like Dr. Chen and Dr. Patel, treated her as they would any promising student. They challenged her with difficult problems and listened carefully to her ideas. Others, however, seemed determined to prove that her early success had been luck. On Tuesday afternoon, Imani arrived at Dr. Whitman's advanced seminar. The room was already full of upperclassmen and graduate students. As she took her seat, Dr. Whitman handed out a set of problems. These are due at our next meeting, he announced. Ms. Johnson, I prepared a special set for you. He placed a separate packet on her desk. Imani flipped through it. The problems were significantly more difficult than those given to the other students. She looked up at Dr. Whitman, who was watching her closely. Is there a reason my problems are different? She asked quietly. Just making sure you're properly challenged, he replied with a thin smile. Since you're so exceptional. On her way out after class, Maya caught up with her in the hallway. Let me see what he gave you, Maya said, taking the packet. She frowned as she looked through the pages. These are qualifying exam questions for PhD students. He's trying to set you up to fail. Imani took back the papers. Then I won't fail. For the next week, Imani slept only 4 hours each night. She worked through Dr. Whitman's impossible problem set while keeping up with her regular classes. When her eyes grew tired, she remembered her grandmother saying, "Some people will never believe you belong unless you prove it twice as well as anyone else." When the next seminar came, Imani placed her completed work on Dr. Whitman's desk. His eyebrows rose slightly as he flipped through the pages. You've had help with these, he stated, not looking up. No, sir, Imani replied firmly. I did them myself. Impossible, he muttered. Some of these problems stumped my graduate students last year. I can explain my process for any problem you choose, Imani offered, aware that other students were watching. Dr. Whitman selected a complex proof from the middle of her packet. Explain this one. For the next 10 minutes, Imani walked through her solution step by step. The room was silent except for her voice. When she finished, even Dr. Whitman couldn't find fault with her work. Later that day, Imani stopped by Dr. Chen's office to discuss his research project. She was surprised to find him in an intense conversation with Dr. Reynolds. We can't keep treating her differently, Dr. Chen was saying. It's unfair and potentially illegal. I'm simply ensuring standards are maintained, Dr. Reynolds replied. Extra scrutiny is necessary when... They fell silent when they noticed Imani standing in the doorway. I can come back later, she said quickly. No, please come in, Dr. Chen insisted. Dr. Reynolds was just leaving. As Dr. Reynolds walked past Imani, he paused. Ms. Johnson, the mathematics department has certain traditions and standards. Not everyone appreciates how disruptive sudden changes can be. After he left, Dr. Chen sighed heavily. I apologize you had to hear that. Some of my colleagues are resistant to change. It's okay, Imani said. I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be, Dr. Chen replied firmly. Next week, A friend of mine is visiting from MIT, Dr. Rosario Diaz. She's a leading expert in the field you're interested in. I'd like you to meet her." That evening, Imani found a small group of allies in the campus library. Maya, two other graduate students who attended Dr. Chen's research meetings, and a sophomore named Mark who had defended her when others questioned her abilities. "They're not going to make it easy for you," Maya told her honestly. "But you're changing things just by being here and doing what you do." Imani nodded, turning back to her calculus book. One equation at a time, she thought. That's how problems get solved, in mathematics and in life. November arrived at Westfield University, bringing cold winds and early darkness. Students hurried between buildings, bundled in scarves and heavy coats. In the mathematics department, tension continued to build around Imani Johnson's presence. Dr. Rosario Diaz from MIT had visited the previous week, and her meeting with Imani had not gone unnoticed. The renowned mathematician had spent 2 hours discussing advanced concepts with the freshmen, then invited her to apply for a special summer program at MIT, an opportunity usually reserved for graduate students. On a particularly cold Tuesday evening, Imani worked alone in the mathematics lab. Most students had returned to their dorms, but she preferred the quiet space with its large whiteboards and reference books. She was studying a paper that Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Whitman had published together last year on a new approach to complex differential equations. As she worked through their equations, Imani noticed something strange. A key part of their proof didn't seem to work for all possible cases. She double-checked her work, then triple-checked it. There was definitely a problem with their mathematics. "That can't be right," she muttered to herself, staring at the whiteboard where she had copied their equations. They're both experienced mathematicians. But the error was clear to her now. Their proof failed when the input values went beyond a certain range, a special case they hadn't considered. Imani sat down, unsure what to do. Pointing out a mistake in her professor's published work could make her situation even more difficult. But as she thought about it more, she realized there might be a way to extend their proof to cover the missing cases. For the next 3 hours, Imani worked steadily, filling whiteboard after whiteboard with equations. By midnight, she had developed a correction that not only fixed the error but expanded the original theory in an interesting new direction. Exhausted but excited, she carefully photographed all her work with her phone before erasing the boards. She would need to check everything again when she was less tired. The next morning, Imani went to see Dr. Chen during his office hours. She showed him her discovery and her proposed solution. "This is remarkable," Dr. Chen said, reviewing her work. "You found a significant limitation in their paper, but instead of just pointing out the problem, you've created an elegant extension." He looked up at her. "What do you plan to do with this?" "I don't know," Imani admitted. "I don't want to cause more problems with Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Whitman." Dr. Chen smiled gently. "In mathematics, truth matters more than feelings. This is important work, Imani. It deserves to be shared." After careful consideration, Imani decided to write up her findings as a paper. Dr. Chen offered to help her prepare it properly for submission to a mathematics journal. They worked on it together for 2 weeks, polishing the language and ensuring the mathematics was clearly presented. When the paper was ready, Dr. Chen suggested they should inform Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Whitman before submitting it. "It's the professional courtesy they deserve," he explained, "and mathematically, this builds on their work rather than tearing it down." Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Whitman received Imani's paper with stony faces. They sat in Dr. Whitman's office, reading through her work in uncomfortable silence. "This is correct," Dr. Whitman finally admitted, looking up from the pages. "We missed this case entirely." "And your extension is quite creative," Dr. Reynolds added reluctantly. "It takes our work in a direction we hadn't considered." Imani sat quietly, waiting for their verdict. "We'll need to be listed as co-authors, of course," Dr. Whitman said, "since this builds directly on our original work." Dr. Chen, who had come with Imani for support, cleared his throat. "Actually, standard practice would be to cite your original paper, but Imani's contribution is original enough to stand as her own work." The tension in the room was thick, but eventually, the senior professors agreed. Imani's paper would be submitted with her name as the primary author, with a strong acknowledgement of their foundational work. As she left the office, Imani felt a strange mixture of pride and anxiety. She had stood her ground on the strength of her mathematics alone. December brought snow to Westfield University. White blankets covered the campus as students prepared for final exams. In the mathematics department, something else was causing excitement. Imani Johnson's paper had been accepted for publication in the Journal of Advanced Mathematical Theory, one of the most respected publications in the field. For a freshman student to have a paper accepted in such a prestigious journal was almost unheard of. The news spread quickly through the mathematics building. "Did you hear about Imani Johnson?" Students whispered in hallways. Her paper got accepted by JMT. Even professors who had previously ignored Imani now acknowledged her with nods in the hallway. Dr. Wickman, though still cool toward her, had stopped giving her impossibly difficult problems in his seminar. Dr. Reynolds had become professionally polite, if not warm. On a Friday afternoon, Imani received an unexpected email from the university president's office requesting a meeting. Nervous but curious, she arrived at the impressive administration building on Monday morning. President Martinez, a woman with short gray hair and kind eyes, welcomed Imani into her office. "Ms. Johnson, thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to a comfortable chair. "I've been hearing quite a lot about you." "You have?" Imani asked, surprised that the president of a major university would know about her. "Your paper is causing quite a stir," President Martinez explained. "And it's come to my attention that your journey in our mathematics department hasn't been entirely smooth." Imani looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. "You don't need to say anything," the president continued gently. "Dr. Chen has kept me informed. I want you to know that Westfield University does not condone the treatment you received from certain faculty members." She slid a folder across her desk. "This is why I called you here today. The Mathematics Faculty Committee has unanimously nominated you for the Westfield Emerging Scholar Award. It comes with a research grant and the opportunity to present your work at the National Mathematics Conference in Chicago next month." Imani stared at the folder in disbelief. The Emerging Scholar Award was typically given to advanced graduate students or young professors. "There's more," President Martinez continued. "Dr. Felix Santos will be visiting Westfield next week. He specifically asked to meet you after reading your paper." Imani's eyes widened. Dr. Santos was one of the most famous mathematicians in the world, a Fields Medal winner whose work had revolutionized several areas of mathematics. "He wants to meet me?" Imani asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Indeed. He was quite impressed by what he called the Johnson extension to the Reynolds-Whitman theorem. The following week brought another surprise. The department was holding its annual holiday reception when Dr. Santos arrived. A small, energetic man with bright eyes and a quick smile. The room fell silent as he entered with Dr. Chen. Dr. Santos scanned the room and walked straight to Imani, ignoring several senior professors who stepped forward to greet him. "You must be Imani Johnson," he said, extending his hand. "Your paper is brilliant. The approach you took to extending the boundary conditions, truly elegant mathematics." From across the room, Imani could see Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Whitman watching, their faces a mixture of surprise and discomfort. "Dr. Reynolds, Dr. Whitman," Dr. Santos called out to them. "You must be proud to have discovered such a talent. Ms. Johnson's work takes your theorem to places you hadn't explored." The two professors nodded stiffly, forced to acknowledge Imani's achievement in front of the entire department. Later that evening, as the reception was ending, Dr. Chen found Imani by the refreshment table. "The president has asked me to tell you something," he said quietly. "After the holidays, the university will be launching a review of teaching practices in the mathematics department. Your experience has highlighted some issues that need addressing." As Imani walked back to her dorm through the gently falling snow, she felt a complex mix of emotions. The road had not been easy, but her voice, expressed through the universal language of mathematics, had finally been heard. Spring sunshine warmed the Westfield University campus as students returned from their winter break. Much had changed in the mathematics department over the past 3 months. The university's review of teaching practices had led to new policies for faculty and a formal mentorship program for underrepresented students in STEM fields. Imani Johnson walked confidently through the mathematics building, no longer feeling like an outsider. Her presentation at the National Mathematics Conference had been a success, attracting attention from researchers at several prestigious universities. 3 different professors had already approached her about summer research opportunities. As she passed the department office, Mrs. Davis, the secretary who had worked there for 30 years, waved her inside. "Imani, this came for you," she said, handing over a large envelope. "Looks important." The envelope bore the seal of the American Mathematical Society. Inside, Imani found a formal letter inviting her to participate in their annual Young Mathematicians Symposium, an honor typically reserved for doctoral students. "Congratulations," said a voice behind her. Imani turned to see Dr. Reynolds standing in the doorway. His demeanor toward her had slowly shifted from reluctance to grudging respect. "Thank you, Dr. Reynolds," she replied politely. He hesitated, then said, "The department meeting is starting soon. We're discussing changes to the undergraduate curriculum. As our star student, your input would be valuable." Imani nodded, surprised but pleased by the invitation. "I'll be there." In the large department meeting room, Imani took a seat near Dr. Chen. The room was full of professors, with several graduate student representatives as well. At the front, Dr. Whitman stood beside a new face, Dr. Lisa Cook, recently hired as part of the department's effort to diversify its faculty. "Before we begin," Dr. Whitman announced, "I have news to share. After 28 years at Westfield, I will be retiring at the end of this semester." Murmurs filled the room. Although no one said it aloud, many knew that the University Review had discovered troubling patterns in Dr. Whitman's treatment of certain students over the years. As the meeting progressed, Imani listened carefully as they discussed ways to make advanced mathematics more accessible to all students. When asked for her opinion, she spoke thoughtfully about her own experiences. "Mathematics itself doesn't care what you look like or where you come from," she said, "but the way it's taught can open doors or close them." Several professors nodded in agreement. Even Dr. Reynolds seemed to be listening intently. After the meeting, Maya, now in her final semester of graduate school, caught up with Imani in the hallway. "You've changed this place," she said simply. "Next fall, 5 new black students will be joining the mathematics program. 2 of them mentioned you as their inspiration when they applied." Imani felt a surge of emotion. "I was just trying to survive here," she said quietly. "Sometimes that's how change happens," Maya replied. "One person refuses to be pushed out, and suddenly the door is open a little wider for everyone else." Later that afternoon, Imani met with her study group in the mathematics lab, a diverse collection of students who had formed around her over the past months. Among them was Thomas, the graduate student who had once doubted her abilities but now regularly asked for her input on his research. As Imani guided a freshman through a difficult problem, she caught sight of herself in the reflection of the window, confident, respected, and completely in her element. The journey had been difficult, but mathematics had given her a language to prove her worth beyond any doubt. That evening, Imani called her grandmother with her latest news. "I'm so proud of you," her grandmother said, "but not surprised. You always had that special gift." "It wasn't just the gift, Grandma," Imani replied. "It was knowing I belonged in that room, even when others said I didn't." As she ended the call, Imani opened her calculus book and began working on a new problem that had been puzzling her. The elegant dance of numbers and symbols flowed across the page, a language that had given her a voice when she needed it most.